This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 539, entitled Masculist Powerful Moral Pressure on Women. Description. This flyer imagines when there are millions of angry, hateful masculists, all conscious of how women oppress men worse than vice versa, with women's decades-lasting manslavery, women's butchery of men in the divorce courts, women's forced fatherhood, etc., who exert their collective masculist anger and hatred at women, putting tremendous moral pressure on women to become biconscious, or suffer terribly by being utterly and viciously rejected by men. Flyer itself. Masculist Powerful Moral Pressure on Women by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. What does it mean for a man to have his masculist consciousness raised? How does this process come about? What causes it to happen? And what usually are its effects? Imagine your average man learning about what happens to one father in 4 in the hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce courts. Imagine him chatting with an acquaintance of his who is a masculist. So rather casually he asks his acquaintance, quote, "What are the main ideas of masculism? What do men have to be liberated from?" Assuming that masculism is men's lib, given that feminism is women's lib. End quote. So the masculist starts telling him about what happens to men in the divorce courts, at a rate of about 1 father in 4. Since the divorce rate amongst fathers is about half, and about half of the divorces, the divorcing wife turns into a vindictive, feminazi bitch, out to extract as much money as she can from her ex-husband, seeing him not as a human being, but as a cash machine to be robbed and abused. Since the divorce courts are controlled by the fluffy feminists, who are monoconscious, that is, have only had their feminist consciousness raised and know nothing about masculism, so feel fully justified in financially butchering 1 in 4 fathers. The masculist explains to his acquaintance that a divorcing father will lose custody of his kids with a 90% probability, lose his house to her, so she can raise her kids in it, will lose half his wealth and stuff to her, be forced to make payments to his kids he will barely be allowed to see. And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, in brackets, that is, traditional woman who expects to be able to live off the labour and money of a man, thus manslaving him for decades of his life, close brackets, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and fip up. So she continues to manslave him after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. The masculist then explains to his acquaintance that manslavery is far and away the biggest source of gender oppression that women commit against men. That is, several billion men across the planet, with several billion women not bothering to fip up, in brackets, equals become fips, equals financially independent persons, close brackets, by bothering to get career competent educations that will make them fips as adults, who pull their financial weight and not expect, fluffy style, to manslave a man for decades. The masculist explains to his acquaintance that to masculists, manslavery is 1,000 times bigger problem than was Negro slavery in the 1800s in the US, since there were several million Negro slaves, while today there are several billion man-slaves. The Masculist tells his acquaintance that the Masculists put powerful moral pressure on women to fip up or be treated as manslavers, as immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin to be wiped out for their massive gender crime of manslaving a man for decades of his life. The Masculist explains that men have been powerfully brainwashed that their role in life is to work for a woman for decades of their lives so that women can stay at home, not working for money, raising the kids. But with the divorce rate at 1 in 2, this task distribution is no longer viable for men, since they will lose custody of their kids with 1 chance in 4. So it's not surprising that now 2/3 of young men in many countries refuse to marry and reject paternity, since they are not prepared to risk a 1 chance in 4 of losing their kids, so choose not to have any kids at all. The Masculist acquaintance then reflects on what he has been told, and gradually comes around to thinking that indeed marriage and paternity are toxic for men. So he understands why 2/3 of young men in many countries reject marriage and paternity. Sometime later, he meets the Masculist again and tells him that he's been thinking about what the Masculist told him, and that the more he thought about it, the angrier he became at the massive injustice it creates. At hearing this, the Masculist then replies saying, quote, "What happens to men in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts is called divorce rape. But it's not the worst form of oppression that women commit against men. The worst form is the decades-lasting manslavery, the not fipping up of women. The fact that, according to the estimates of Masculists, about 80% of young women choose to study fluffy crap majors at high school, making them fluffy crappers as adults, and hence fluffies who realise in their 30s, when they really want to have a kid, that they can't afford to buy a middle-class house with their own money because they are fluffy crappers. So start looking around for some gullible, manslavable man to pay for her to stay at home raising her kids in a house that he pays for. Then after screwing around in her 20s, she will get bored with her 41st penis husband and drag him through the fluffy feminist controlled divorce courts and extract as much money out of him as she can." End quote. The Masculist says, quote, "Those 2 major gender crimes that women commit against men are not the only big ones. Another is what is called forced fatherhood. That is, women have the MARA, maternity rejection right, but men don't have the paternity rejection right. So a woman has a legal right to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, in brackets, commonly referred to as the abortion right, close brackets, that could seriously mess up her life. But men don't have the equivalent right, so instead he gets manslaved for several decades, forced to pay for a kid he never wanted in the first place. This is another massive gender injustice that women commit against men." Close quote. The acquaintance then stews on these Masculist statements and becomes increasingly aware that the Masculists have a set of very powerful arguments that in his view are stronger than those of the feminists. He sees that even rape is small beer in comparison to decades-lasting manslavery, working for a fluffy wife who did not bother to fip up and expects to live off the money and labour of a man, which makes her a manslaver. Now imagine that this type of conversation takes place between millions of men, resulting in millions of men becoming masculists as they become conscious that gender oppression is a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men worse than vice versa, as the above big examples show. Now imagine what will happen when there are millions of angry masculists who have had their masculist consciousness raised, and how will they react towards fluffies and fluffy feminists? They will be very angry with them and put powerful moral pressure on them to become biconscious, that is, to have both their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised. These millions of masculists will become quite impatient with monoconscious feminists and call them MFBs, that's monoconscious, feminazi, bigots, seeing them as close-minded to the idea that gender oppression is a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men worse because of the big three mentioned above, plus other ways that women oppress men. When there are millions of masculists, it will be impossible for feminists to remain monoconscious, since if some feminist makes some misandrous statement in public, there will be masculists in the audience who will bite her fucking head off, with ferocious masculist anger and hatred at what women do to men, especially with women's decades manslavery, the butchery of fathers in the divorce courts, forced fatherhood, etc. These masculists will hurl these masculist facts at these feminazis, and the more these feminazis object, the stronger will be the hostility and hatred coming from the masculists. And since masculists are men with 10 times the level of testosterone in their blood than women, these men will be terrifyingly verbally aggressive towards these monoconscious feminists, these MFBs, scaring these women shitless, who will become painfully conscious that something has happened to men. Yes, men have become masculisted. They have been taught masculist ideas and have become angry, then hateful, at the massive gender injustices that women commit against men, and become determined to fight against these injustices and to remove them by changing the gender expectations of society and men fairing the gender laws, especially in the divorce courts, legislating the para, setting up gender equality committees in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally. As masculist ideas spread, women will come under tremendous moral pressure to stop committing major gender crimes against men, or be severely punished by not only not getting one, but by being viciously rejected by men, spat at, rejected both socially and sexually, pariahed, shunned, and vilified. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 530 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.